So I've been vested with the responsibility of summing up this last session. And I want to thank all our speakers for their terrific points and for staying on time. The best laid plans of mice and men often go astray. Manuel and I had hoped to put this up on a whiteboard or on the computer, but it just wasn't going to work since the keyboard is actually up there and not down here. Therefore, we will resort to the time-honored way of doing this, which is simply verbally. We heard from Peter first let me backtrack and say what was the aim of this particular workshop? And it was, how do we identify measures to ensure information sharing? That was the point that we really wanted to address. And we heard from Peter that there are several opportunities. These include such things as holding workshops, fostering networking, endorsing research agendas, and advising the funding agencies about what is regarded as important research issues. And I couldn't agree with him more about those very things. We heard from Russell about the importance of risk management strategies of the TOUCH program, how valuable that's been, and how we need to avoid being overly burdensome. At least the regulators need to avoid being overly burdensome when they design these sorts of programs. And this was a point that Ralph endorsed as well, how important the registry is in informing us as to what's happening with our patients. We heard from Sophie about the consortium and the fact that a number of companies have come together and overcome their, I suspect, natural resistance to collaboration, sharing data, funding research that collectively will assist them as well as the healthcare providers and patients, and at the same time ensuring patient privacy and scientific integrity. And that education is going to be a fundamental component of the PML consortium. We heard from Igor how the clinical researcher is the ideal partner, sort of wedding industry and the patients, the clinical practice of medicine. And important points included better access to clinical studies, facilitating exchange of opinions, particularly with respect to how best to manage patients, and promoting the research collaborations. And that gets back to Peter's points as well, which is holding the workshops and fostering networking, which is something that we heard from other speakers as well. Jean spoke about something that maybe few of us knew about, and that is the Public Communications Office at the NIH and how PML is actually on their website, as it is a disease that's being investigated. We heard of the value of public advocacy, and certainly we've seen how important that is with respect to HIV, although the numbers of people doing the advocating are much smaller, I suspect, with respect to PML. And we heard about the importance of making PML a reportable disease, and I too would agree with Jean that that's very important, and I'm not quite sure how to make that happen. Ralph spoke once again about the compulsory patient registries and what we learned about them, and again that gets back to the points made earlier by Dr. Katz. He also spoke about surrogate markers and looking at independent studies that tell us whether these surrogate markers are helpful or not, and addressing natural clearance mechanisms. And I will tell you, in my opinion, and since I'm here, I'm able to editorialize in this position, I think the Germans are ahead of the Americans with respect to this. That is, the competence, I was unaware of this until he mentioned it in his talk, but this competence that the medical community is attempting to ensure in MS care providers. You know, that they know the medications that they're using, that they know the complications that arise, they know what to do when those complications arise. That's not happened in the United States. It's not happened by decree. It's happening de facto because people are afraid of the liability for the most part and simply don't want to deal with it. And I mentioned that in one of the talks that I gave. And then lastly, we heard, and importantly from Christoph, with respect to the importance of the patient and the caregiver and keeping them in the loop and advising them as to what we know about these drugs and the importance of a central database. You know, he also mentioned this internet-based networking, and the thought occurred to me that one of the advantages of having such an internet-based networking would be a call to the patients to involve themselves in ongoing studies. I've been approached by several people in the audience who are principals in small companies that have ideas that they'd like to pursue, and one of the things they would like to have is access to clinical material. Why the hell do you have to go to me? Why don't you approach the patients themselves? 80% of them that have received natalizumab are still alive. I mean, it would seem to me that if I were a patient, that's what I'd want to do. I'd want to promote the science to understand the disease. So it provides a remarkable opportunity, I would think, to approach the patient directly and say, please, we'd like your cooperation, and from that point, you can contact their physicians. I would like to say one other thing, because Dr. Katz said something that sort of pricked me a bit, and that was, we need to know who needs what information. And I just want to say that there's a patronizing component to that. You know, as a treating physician, I like to know everything. And I will tell you that there's nothing worse than hearing the gossip in the hallways of a meeting about patients that have suffered certain complication of an illness, and it may or may not be true. So if somebody has that information and knows it, why don't you reveal it? Why don't you tell us what the emis is, the truth, right? So, I mean, this is something that I feel very, very strongly about, and I don't think that we should be doling out information. We should make it broadly available, but that, of course, is my opinion. And that's my summary. I'll turn it over to questions. Please.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that whatever information is available should be out there. But in some sense, you can think of that as a data dump. I don't think anything should be withheld, quite frankly. But different constituencies are interested in different things. So you might be interested in everything, but another patient constituency might be interested in a certain portion of the information. My point of view was talk to people, find out what they want to know. That was the point. If you want to know everything, that's great. Somebody else might want to know this, but we need to find that out as opposed to just data dumping in some format that won't be useful to certain constituencies.
Okay, now I understand. Questions? Questions? Please.
Yeah, but listening to the various Peter Arlett, Russell Katz, and others, I mean, it seems that talking about PML, there is a need to make information available maybe more to patients and families than physicians, but with the caveat that it needs to be regulated, and you don't want to duplicate, create yet another website if another website exists. My question is this one, and I don't represent the consortium. Colleagues or Milan are part of the consortium, but I'm not talking on behalf of the consortium. But just in the spirit of candid exchange, if the PML consortium, for example, desired one day to make, let's say, the state of the art about PML outcomes, treatment, and things like that, how would that be regulated? Because this is a group of 5 companies talking about a disease, not a drug, but it touches somehow a drug. So my question is to Russell Katz and Peter Arlett, how would you approach that? Would DDMAC go and review about who should the consortium make a proposal? How would you view that?
Well, as I said, there are many obstacles, and you described some of them earlier about the potential for information being disseminated appearing to be promotional, and there are rules about this. I don't know all the rules. But yeah, I think there would have to be a wide circle of folks in the agency brought together to examine the question of how do we make this available? It seems so obvious. You just make the data available. But as you say, there are many obstacles. But I don't think it's impossible. And there are many groups in the agency who are involved in the dissemination of information publicly. So I don't know the answer. I just think it's the kind of a question we could sit down and talk about.
Maybe just to complement that, it was very interesting listening to the different presentations today because lots of people have websites. I think we're not short of websites. What we may be short of is the definitive website or people all buying into a particular information source. It may be, however, that they're serving slightly different purposes. But just things I noted, the consortium has a website, MSIF has a website, NIH has a website. I know the European Commission, not specifically on PML, but does disease awareness type information in Europe. And I think, Mr. Declan Walsh, you're running a website also, very much focused on the patient perspective. So there is quite a lot of information there. I suppose the question is about coordinating that information and in some way validating best information. I also, because you've made a couple of interventions in the last 2 days about the role of industry, and I understand that this is an area where, particularly on the European side, there is a lack of clarity. But my understanding, and maybe I might give the floor to June Rain from a member state perspective, because a lot of it is regulated at a member state level, but that an industry consortium making information available about a disease, I don't think there's a problem there. The problem comes when when a company makes specific information available about its products, and then there's the whole question about promotion. But I don't know, June, if you could help me, just because different member states have got different perspectives on this.
I think that's the point, thank you, Peter, that clearly industry may not have the same message coming from all the countries. Sweden, I think, is rather forward-thinking. There are others that perhaps less comfortable. As you say, I think the principle of factual, up-to-date information, particularly about a disease entity, should not fall foul of any advertising or promotional controls. Let's look to the new legislation that you yourself have highlighted from the European Commission to create the level playing field we all want to see. There should not be barriers.
Panosynthesis NDA. I wanted to add to this point from my previous experience at the EMEA. The whole situation reminds me of the time when there was the issues of the HIV research, the heart, and the cardiovascular risks, when the consortium doing that research used to go to the CHMP and present updates on how the research was going and what resources were available. So even though that's a bigger clinical area and this is more defined, I would think that that kind of exchange could be useful for this topic. Don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Peter.
I think we are, well, first of all, we have regulatory obligations on individual companies to come and report. We have an industry consortium which is already making presentations to the regulatory committees in Europe. And if I've understood correctly, there's liaison with FDA directly also. Whether we can structure that more, well, maybe we can. And as you may have seen in the slides from Sophie, EMA already has an observer on the advisory panel for the consortium. Now, I think one of the questions that will come up and hopefully has been fostered by this workshop is perhaps from the leveraging the input from different stakeholders, further maximizing input from stakeholders, looking for alternative funding sources, perhaps with an industry consortium at the core or a multi-stakeholder consortium, whether we can broaden the amount of funding, broaden the number of research questions being addressed. And I was very encouraged by Jean Major's thoughts about, if you like, a bigger consortium with greater partners involved. But just to give the direct answer to your question, Panos, I think we absolutely do need regular updates in terms of the research that is ongoing, both from individual companies but also from the consortium. And I'm certainly from an EMA perspective, we'll make sure that happens.
Wanted to comment on a couple of points. First, just about information dissemination. I think that this is really a tight wire act that we're asked to follow. On the one hand, people all want to have access to as much information as possible, but as we know from the internet, there's a lot of false information, leads that are either intentionally or unintentionally set out. If the referring physician for Igor's patient had looked at that mass lesion and said, you know, I think I've got a glioblastoma that's now been reported with natalizumab. We know Gene Major has a model, this class of viruses causes tumors. And, you know, in a matter of a week, this investigator could have set the world afire with what is, in essence, nonsense. That, you know, that's not what that represented. And so vetting thoughtful dissemination of information so that it doesn't do as much damage or more damage than good is really a critical role, and gaining authority, I think, is achieved by balancing a balancing act of the different people in tension in the ultimate process of drug development. So the regulators, academics, the industry, if there's some group that has a tension between these, then a greater sense of authority that this is trustworthy information that one can act on and respond to in a level way is a critical thing to achieve. And I think that we're going to have to struggle, and there'll be missteps, and we'll fall off the wire many times. But I do think that many times people want just everything, and there have been lots of rumors around what else is going on in the immune system and complications and so on with this drug and others that have distracted from the messages that we need to have. The second thing, I just wanted to challenge Dr. Katz a little bit, because, you know, I think that we're talking here, in my simple mind, I have nothing really to do with drug regulation at all, but up to this point in the United States, there have been basically 3 classes of drugs, and they've been defined by the risk-benefit sort of relationship. Some drugs are so safe and have such minimal risks that they're sold over the counter, and so that's one class of drugs. Other drugs are illegal. It's, you know, their risk is deemed greater than their therapeutic benefit, and so that's another clear class. And the third has been prescribed drugs, where a physician's opinion about the appropriateness of the use of them for a condition, whether it's you know, in the United States, whether it's an approved one or not, the physician's expertise is deemed necessary and appropriate to prescribe that drug to an individual. And we're now talking about sort of carving out a new class of drug where there may be a greater risk, and where either, you know, Joe's expert, or in Europe, people that are especially trained and expert in a category of disease or drug use, or you know, some other mechanism like the touch program, so people that have been trained and have a routine way of dealing with the drug. So we're kind of talking about a new class of regulation. And I'm a little bit concerned about buying the approach of the touch program you know, completely, because I think we've had a little clinical trial here. Europe has not had a touch program. The United States has. We found more cases of PML in Europe than in the United States. And it's not clear to me that the management of the disease or the outcomes has been demonstrated to be different. And there's a considerable cost from the prescribers and others. I think that we may have a closer, a fuller database up front about patients that have been enrolled in touch. But if this is an approach, and you know, it is a reasonable approach in my mind, but if it's going to be the way, I think that we ought to be seeking evidence of how great its value is, and does that value really counterbalance the cost of restricting access and the use of the drugs? And so can we use this example, or if we have another example, how do we prove to ourselves that this is a good way to invest?
Well, it's a good question, and as there are built-in mechanisms to assess various aspects of it. I mean, that's part of the rule for if you have a REMS. Now, again, the REMS assessments don't necessarily assess how successful the program is. They assess things like, do the physicians understand what they're supposed to do? If the patients read the med guide, do they understand what the risks are and what they need to do if something happens? So, you know, there's room to think about how the best way to assess them. The law was passed. I mean, this mechanism was adopted, and I'm not the expert about why, but because it was felt that some drugs needed sort of an extra assurance that they could be used appropriately. I've heard from eminent MS researchers that they're very happy that the TOUCH program exists because it tells them what to do. They know the best way to take care, you know, to ensure that the patient should be getting the infusion. But of course, this particular person works at a big center, and you know, it's part of what they do now. So I would assume it's a truism that there are folks who won't use the drug because it's too burdensome, and we have to continually reassess whether or not that's true. But there is no formal mechanism that I know of to assess that. So we have to think about how to do that, and we certainly don't want that to be the case. On the other hand, you don't want somebody to use the drug cavalierly. So it's of course we're going to have to learn. Now you know, the contrast between the way the drug is marketed and used in Europe versus the U.S. It's a point well taken, but I don't know exactly how comparable they are. You say you have more cases of PML in Europe. I think what's fair to say is that we probably have every case in the U.S. There may be more cases that are known in Europe, doesn't mean it's every case. So there's at least that potential advantage. But it's arguable about you think about the risk-benefit, the risk of the burdensomeness versus the benefit of treating. And also, you know, how the drug is used and how the data are obtained and documented in Europe. It's possible that the reason we're getting so much good data in Europe is because there was a TOUCH program in the U.S. And it sort of set the template for how data should be obtained. I'm not saying that's true, but you could imagine that that's a possibility, even though there isn't an official TOUCH program in Europe. I mean, how people deal with the drug may be, to some extent, modeled after the precedent set by the TOUCH program. So it's not obvious that it would have been used the way it's being used in Europe had there not been a TOUCH program. But look, I take your point. We're going to have to learn. We have to follow usage, and of course, it's difficult to know how much usage there should be in the United States as we follow it. Other drugs get approved that people might want to use, or we don't know how many people should have been getting it in the first place, and therefore it's hard to know whether or not the TOUCH program is impeding its use. So it's certainly something that needs to be, an attempt needs to be made over time to see whether or not this is just getting in the way. And of course, we need to hear from the people who are out there and find out what they think about it. And just one minor point, the use of the word restricted use. In some sense, I guess you could say it's restricted, but it's not restricted in the sense of who can use it. Anybody can use it. As long as they're willing to go through, you know, the training. There are mechanisms whereby you can actually restrict the drug's use so that only board-certified whatevers can use it, you know, or only tertiary centers can use it. So it's not restricted in a formal sense.
Sophie Molly.
Yeah, I have one comment listening to the conversation here. It's about, you know, we've been talking about case reporting. We've been talking about data collection, and most of the data that we've seen during the session, I think, were TISABRI driven, and of course probably linked to this huge risk management plan in place for that drug. But I think I would like to remember this group here that we need to find ways for the other cases. Because I think Tasabri and the MS population is one thing, but we as sponsors and here particularly in this room, we're facing also spontaneous cases which are reported in other disease like RA, like oncology, HIV, and we're saying that we're interested in all cases. And I think this is something for the group to think, and how can we best report the cases so we have the information. And not necessarily, we have the touch program as an example, but we need to think also in a broader scope how we can make that happen in a minimum way or in the best way, minimum quality of data I meant, in the other field, because I think the MS community in some ways has, I would quote this as a luxury to be with the primary audience with a neurologist, but being with an oncologist or being with a rheumatologist, this is another ways to approach diagnosis or so forth, or even in transplant. I've heard that, you know, you got a headache with an MS patient, it's not usual, you get an MRI. I'm not sure with a transplant patient you have the same patient management. So I think we need also to approach this from a broader perspective, because I think for case reporting, it's extremely important.
I just want to make one more point about the REMS and about that. REMS, at least in neurology, REMS or REMSs, I'm not sure what the plural is, like touch, are rare. That's sort of a last ditch attempt. You know, this is a drug with a known risk, a known very bad risk, and that's what we were faced with. The typical MS drug, even if it's, you know, by mechanism, looks like it's something we might be worried about. If there's no manifest risk, it's very unusual to have these sort of extensive REMS. The other thing I'd point out about, you know, the case ascertainment, I don't know how to do it either. I like the idea of reportable disease. I was going to actually say that, but at least 3 or 4 speakers in the last this session more or less were saying the same thing, which is that whether it's compulsory registry or some other language, reportable disease, we should really try to get all the cases somehow. Easier said than done, I know.